Good afternoon. We are at the Interamerican Institute for Democracy. We're very pleased to welcome you back to our forum and also to have been able to schedule a sensational discussion on one of the most important countries in our hemisphere, Brazil. Brazil, as you almost know, has been the country of innovations since its inception. It was the only nation in Latin America to be the siege of the Metropolitan Authority when King João replaced Lisbon with Rio de Janeiro as capital city of the Portuguese Empire. Brazil also became independent and a republic without recourse to arms, which was a very innovative way to conduct politics in Latin America, given that elsewhere in the region, both independence as well the arrival of the republic was through armed struggle. In the 1950s, Brazilian approach to architecture revolutionized forever the urban landscape everywhere in the world. In the 1960s, Brazilian music enriched rock and roll. More recently, its soccer national team is the sole team to have won for 5 times the World Cup. And from the political perspective, in the 21st century, Brazil has conducted an exemplary fight against corruption through the Lava Jato process. Today, it is governed by a leader who has no ties to the traditional elites and interest groups. This has created a wave of rejection among many sections of the elite that aim at continuing to enjoy political and economic privileges. Those groups have penetrated the legislative power and the judiciary to paralyze the government agenda and to make things very difficult for President Jair Bolsonaro. Today, we would like to go over this process with truly exceptional guests. Professor Fabio Malina Losso from the Harvard School of Public Policy of the University of Chicago, and Luiz Phillipe d'Orleans and Bragança, who's a writer, a thinker, and a congressman. The introductory remarks will be delivered by our Executive Director, Carlos Sanchez Berzain, 5 times Minister of the Republic of Bolivia, and our founding director. While the closing remarks will be delivered by our Chairman, Tomas Regalado, an sterling mayor of Miami, a great journalist, and an award-winning thinker of the Cuban American community. With not much ado, I would please ask Carlos Sanchez Berzain, our Executive Director, to deliver his opening remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, Beatrice. Thank you for coming, Fabio, Luiz Phillipe, and our President, Mr. Tomas Regalado. The Interamerican Institute for Democracy, our institution, is a non-profit organization whose objective is the promotion and defense the principles and values of freedom, democracy, human rights in the Americas. It consists of academic, politicians, professionals, workers, entrepreneurs, men and women of different nationalities. Luiz Phillipe is member of our board, our group of consulting. It is our institution, it is a non-partisan, pluralistic center of a truth that for the achieve the objectives carries out academic research, seminars, colloquiums, forums, and international events. We have an editorial fund for which we publish it in English and Spanish and now in Portuguese. More than 60 works that contribute to dissemination and defense the values and we are promote. And in this case, I say that the region, the Americas, there are 2 Americas. One is the democracy and the other one is the dictatorship. That is the title of one of my book published approximately 5 years ago. One democratic and other dictatorial. There is the confrontation in the 21st century and is based on the aggression of the dictatorship to democracies. This aggression has deepened since the second half of the last year, 2019, and has become more intense by taking advantage of the coronavirus pandemic. Brazil is one of the democracies threatened by the attack of the Castro Chavism. The Castro Chavism is the conjunction of Castro and Chavez from Cuba and Venezuela, and continuing with action started in the second half of 2019 and reactivate with the opportunity the pandemic now provides them. Currently in the Americas, there are conspiratory efforts with coup d'etat underway in the last Ecuador, Bolivia, and Brazil. Look, Brazil. There is also the source of the destabilization agenda in Chile, Colombia, and Peru. Every democratic government of the Americas must only look at its internal situation, and it will find the criminal hand of the Castro Chavism, with 61 years of expertise operating with the new model, building with the elimination of freedom and Venezuela's will given by Chavez that we now call Castro Chavism. This is the point. Brazil is very important. The Brazil democracy today is under great pressure, and this is the issue that this meeting. Thank you for the QUO VADIS Brazil, and welcome at our works. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. And now we are going to have with us Professor Fabio Malina Losso. Mr. Malina Losso is a Brazilian lawyer and a businessman. He holds a PhD in civil law with distinctions from the Universidade de Sao Paulo. Mr. Malina Losso is a visiting scholar of the University of Chicago, where he is a council member at the Harris School of Public Policy since 2009. Welcome, Mr. Malina.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Thank you for the invitation, Mayor Regalado, Carlos, Sanchez for the introduction. It's great to see you, Congressman Luiz Phillipe. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all. And I hope to contribute with a few thoughts. And I would begin taking advantage of the introduction Carlos just offered us. I would begin doing some comments on the recent publications, the international media, notably the New York Times, when they covered Brazil. I don't see democracy as a threat in Brazil. First, because we have strong institutions. We have a constitutional design that defines a strong legislative branch. We have here a member of this legislative branch, Congressman Luiz Phillipe, a strong executive branch, which is supposed to follow the legislation that the legislative branch elaborates, and we have the third branch, which is the judiciary branch. Those three branches, the Constitution defines these. They are independent and they are harmonic. So sometimes one of the branches invades the other attributions, and it's usual, it's common in a democracy. And these systems of checks and balances, it's being tested all the time. And right now, and it's one of the topics of my brief conversation, of my brief introduction, we are having a struggle between the executive branch and the judiciary branch due to a cause, due to a legal process where the judiciary, our Supreme Court, is willing to define limits and possibly restrictions for the freedom of speech. And this is going to be my major topic tonight. If you allow me, I would talk about how the digital communications changed our world and changed the politics, changed the electoral process, and it's changing our society. And I would start with a very brief consideration on how technology, how portable devices changed the press. Mayor Regalado can say much better than myself about how important is the press for democracy and how important is the freedom of speech for democracy. Recently, with the social media, with the internet, people started to have, the regular Joe, we can say, start to have voice. With the Twitter, with Facebook, and with several other social media apps, one can easily transmit his own thoughts, and one can easily reach an impressive audience. And this is a real threat for the authorities, for the established authorities, like the press itself, because press has always been authoritative on the subjects it showed and it presented for the population. And the press has always been the eyes and also the voice of the population. The press, with its criticism, the free press, with its criticism, always had a very important role on the society. However, with the internet, people started to notice that one could directly reach the information. So the intermediaries are not so relevant anymore. Naturally, we would always look for a good information. And naturally, per consequence, the search for a good information is going always to be a very important way to promote democracy. However, there is no such thing as a monopoly anymore. there is no monopoly of truth. If before a newspaper like the New York Times was the only source for information, let's say in the beginning of the last century, today we can have thousands, if not millions, of sources of informations. Well, I would like to say a little bit about the Arab Spring, which introduced a very important debate in a very novel form of speech. If we recall, just after the Arab Springs, which promotes an intense dissolution of authoritarian governments, just after we had Zuccotti Park occupy New York, manifestations, demonstrations, and we can notice that if the Arab Spring started with not necessarily an ideology or partisanship, it was a fight for democracy. Then, Occupy New York movement started to have some kind of leftism on their movement. In 2013 in Brazil, we had a demonstration or a series of demonstrations that began with some kind of revolt against the raise of transportation tariffs. Just after that, people using social media, using Facebook, using Twitter, people started together, and there was no way to have only one ideology on the demonstrations. And in Brazil, we had, before the technologies, we had this experience of just having demonstrations from syndicates, from leftists. So after that, this is an important mark, 2013. More people, not necessarily moved by a direct ideology, but moved by the intention of promoting their speech, their voices, the intent to be heard, started to come to the street. So this was a very important landmark in Brazilian recent trajectory of democracy. And several movements started after 2013. In 2014, we had the car wash operation, which the Federal Prosecutor's Office, there is a task force. They started to go after the agents of crony capitalism here in Brazil. And when I mean crony capitalism, I refer to the capitalism we used to have in Brazil in the last 2 decades. It's not a real capitalism. We had 2 decades actually of leftist government. Before we had, let's say, a light leftist government, which for good promoted several liberalization movement, several privatizations of telecom and in energy sectors. They kept some monopolies, but what we had here in Brazil, it was a mix of crony capitalism and, in the political sense, lots of regulations, a very strong armed government in the federal level. Well, what happens after? Traditionally, non-herd portion of population after the car wash operation, they started to gather in public demonstrations, and they could invert the way demonstrations in Brazil were always used to happen. People from this, like centrists, rightists, light leftists and light rightists started together to fight against corruption. This was the ignition. Then these people started to have voice with the social media. And then these people elected the President Jair Bolsonaro. The President Jair Bolsonaro had a very poor campaign in the sense of financing, like no funds. He used social media. He used YouTube lives, Facebook, Twitter. He has a very harsh speech against politicians. Sometimes he has a very harsh speech against his own partisans, and he inaugurated a new era here in Brazil of how to do politics. With him, a series of new governors were also elected with the same speech, with the same harsh speech against corruption and against the political system. Several congressmen here in Brazil and the high Congress, like the Senate and also the Chamber of Deputies, they get elected with this speech of conservatism and also a liberal speech, and they are fighting for freedoms at this stage. They are fighting against the narrative, this 20-year-old narrative we used to have here in Brazil of based on the corporativism and based on what you, Beatrice, said very well in an article that I read yesterday, against the intelligentsia. So today we have here in Brazil a kind of monopoly of press based on traditional media groups, which is fighting against this new digital age. They are artificially trying to promote a clash between the freedom of speech and the freedom of press. And it's nonsense, because freedom of press is one of the portions of freedom of speech. And this is something that one thing does not invalidate the other. And at this point, and 10 days ago, or 2 weeks ago, our Supreme Court, not considering some authors and some members of the press, of this new press, which are doing harsh, tough criticism against the current politics and also against the judiciary branch. They started to be not only investigated, because it appears that they were investigated before, but they started to be targets on an investigation. This case, this legal case, as I said before, is ruling on limits of free speech in Brazil. Naturally, it's a dangerous case, because it necessarily should preserve the freedom of speech, but it is also somehow causing a threat for the same freedom of speech. So this set of definitions in parallel are happening in the National Congress. There is a project of law going on the Senate, which is also trying to create several limitations for the free speech. Hopefully, the amendments that are being proposed by the other senators are successful, and this project of law, which I'm studying, are not to be a threat to the freedom of speech. Well, to finalize, to end this first intervention, I would like to say that Brazil has a vibrant democracy. I can say that our president, perhaps not in a refined way, he's not an academic, he is not perhaps all the time a polite person, he can say bad words, but he is sincere in what he says. I don't see at this stage any kind of threat to democracy coming from the executive branch. I can see that the legislative doing his part with his members, and even the judiciary, perhaps sometimes crossing some limits, can preserve democracy in Brazil. Hopefully is what's going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these very enlightening remarks, Mr. Malina. Now we are going to have the presentation on the Brazil's reform agenda by Luiz Phillipe de Orleans y Bragança. Phillipe de Orleans y Bragança is a congressman, is an activist, is a businessman, and a member of the Imperial House of Orleans and Bragança. He was elected federal deputy for Sao Paulo in the 2018 Brazilian elections for the Social Liberal Party, with 118 votes being the 33rd most voted in the state. Mr. Orleans and Bragança's career began in the United States, where he worked in financial institutions. He's also founded the liberal movement Acorda Brasil in 2014. He has introduced several groundbreaking legislative proposals, such as the presidential veto, the redeployment of federal expenditures, and the enactment of a new constitution along the lines of the Brazilian constitution of the 19th century. We also 1824. Sorry. We also are very, very privileged and honored at the Interamerican Institute for Democracy to have Phillipe de Orleans as member of our council. And with any more ado, I would like to give him the floor.
Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you, everyone from the Interamerican Institute for Democracy. It's a very important institute that works to provide sustenance of democracy, freedom, and everything that goes with it. I'm sorry? I'm hearing an echo, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So thank you, everyone. Well, basically, Brazil is going through a political crisis right now. And what is causing the political crisis? The pandemic is just basically it's just a moment that will pass for sure, but it's a test for our institutions. It's a test for the current new government. However, we have a recurring crisis in Brazil, which is the presidential system. We have a proportional vote. It's different from the voting system in the US. The voting system in the US, it's a majority vote and a districtal arrangement for representation. So the districtal arrangement and the majority process, it provides the creation of majorities, and it provides a creation of ability to govern more easily. The proportional system, which Brazil has, it creates a huge fragmentation of power. So the legislative power is very fragmented. And the president, really, he does not really have a base or a representative base of congressmen in order to represent himself. So he will always be a minoritarian, a president that is elected also as a majority leader. However, his representation in Congress will always be minoritarian. So there's always a need and requirement to do coalitions. The current president decided not to do coalitions because the past coalitions were prejudicial to the republic in the sense that they were either socialists, hardcore extremist socialists, or corrupt individuals. So he decided not to do any type of partnerships on that front. So that has proven incredibly difficult with the presidential system. So he withstood for about a year and a half in that mode of not creating partnerships with Congress. And what happened is that Congress decided to conspire against the executive branch. So what the president has done recently is actually to do the coalition and bring many of these members. Now it's a new actually a new Congress, so he's able to pick and choose better partnerships. However, he's backtracking on some of his promises on not to do that. So it's exposing him to future corruption scandals, which have been not the case over the past year and a half. So it's been a very positive government on that front for the past year and a half. Now that he's doing these coalitions, there's a risk that is opening up for the future. We'll see. It's still too early. So in doing that, he mitigated the effects of Congress taking away power from the executive branch. Once that was done, and that is quite recent, the other force, which is the judiciary, they have all the judges in Brazil have been selected by either progressive, hardcore progressive, or socialist or corrupt presidents. So in that case, there is a definite ideology of our judiciary, and they're not also wanting to allow the government to govern in the same way that Congress did not want to do that in the beginning or over the past year and a half. So now the next challenge is the judiciary. The judiciary is also conspiring against the executive, not allowing him to govern. So they're overreaching in their power. They're actually mitigating some of the actions that the president is taking, and which are constitutional actions. So the perception in the US, North America, and Europe that there is a dictatorship in Brazil, that he is a dictator, that has been, I'm not sure how the media came up with that narrative, considering the visual, which is very accepted reality in Brazil, which is exactly the opposite, where he is being interfered by either Congress or the judiciary. And as a congressman, I can attest to that fact, where I actually asked the executive branch to interfere a bit more in Congress, because Congress was passing laws against budgeting, creating even larger budgeting constraints for the executive, and the executive was not doing anything on that regard. So very passive on that front, and really does not want to interfere in any of these institutions. So that is the reality from a congressman perspective. And what we've created is a sort of a mix between a parliamentary system and a presidential system, where the budget is defined by parliament. And parliament, there's no real government or no coalition that really leads parliament. It's an incredibly fragmented house. So there's really no north there for us to provide any secure leadership. So what am I alluding to? What type of reforms are we talking about? These are recurring issues. It's not that the President Bolsonaro, because of him, we have a fragmented Congress. This has been our nature since the presidential system was implemented in Brazil and refined over the beginning of the 20th century. We have political issues. We have a political reform that is required. So we need electoral reform. We need the party system reform as well. Many of the parties in Brazil, they became oligarchies, where they control budget, they control funding for their own campaigns. So public funding for elections. So that is a reality in Brazil. We need to get rid of that in order to have a truly open and free system. So those are some of the main political reforms. Also, we have issues on the economy. The economy is based on, is limited by a constitution, which is not as the American Constitution. It is a very welfare state type of constitution, which is typical of what Europe saw in the beginning of the 20th century. However, many European countries abandoned that type of constitution, and Brazil did not. So we have a node type of frame of welfare state type of constitution, which allows every type of interference in the economy, every type of interference in our behavior. So that is a limiting factor, and also a destabilizing factor for the country. On a recurring basis, every president will have this power. So it's not that we will need to vote for either, conservative. In order for us to have some stability, we'll need to vote for conservative presidents until we change our constitution, because otherwise we'll always have the risk of having a populist, socialist, somebody that is very prone for intervening on the economy and society, to take office and actually doing all these type of programs that disrupt our fiscal basis, creates inflation, disrupt our social structure, meaning some of the progressive candidates that have been that have been showing up in the past, the recent past in Brazil, they have pointed to incredibly intervening policies in society in order to do social justice and social equality narrative in order to allow that. So, these are the dangers that a country like Brazil suffer on a recurring basis. So we need to make sure that we reform not only our economy, but also make them last a long time. So we do need constitutional reform as far as limiting the capacity of governments to intervene in the economy and also intervene in our federal system. I think the United States is suffering from something similar, where there is a natural tendency for centralization, and the presidential power in the US is becoming successively stronger and stronger. In Brazil, we already have a constitutionally very strong president. So we are actually I think maybe both countries have the same issue. We need to make sure that we decentralize this power and make sure that the local governments have more autonomy. Even now in the coronavirus situation, where I was actually criticizing the way it's been addressed in Brazil, so that you understand the federalist problem. Given that the states and the cities, they're not as autonomous as in the United States, what happens is that the federal government, the union, it needs to bail out all these poorly managed states and cities. So basically all the responsibility for bailing out, all the fiscal responsibility for bailing out poor decisions made locally is honored by the union. And that is incredibly destabilizing, because then how are you going to make sure that you propose a lockdown which is not sustainable in any country? Even the best practices of dealing with pandemics in the Far East, they never even think about doing a lockdown. They do other types of measures other than the lockdown in order to preserve the economy and preserve the flow of taxes and so forth, to make sure that you still have a country at the end of the cycle. So they figured it out. However, in the Western world, the United States, Canada, Europe, South America, the Latin America in general, we are in this modus operandi that we think that the World Health Organization is God on earth, and World Health Organization is a haphazard, poor service that we pay for every year. And I think we need to reconsider that, because what they propose is utopic. No city, no state, not even any country can maintain a lockdown mode for a long time. So in Brazil, this problem has been exacerbated, because the union, now the federal government, needs to bail out all these cities and states. And I think that's a bad idea, because we start not thinking about alternatives to a proposition that is not even original from our own country. We are accepting the World Health Organization directives, and they change all the time. They say masks are not good, and then masks are good, and lockdown is excellent, and maybe you should not do the lockdown. So they're everywhere, and as far as solutions and propositions. So that's one of the problems that we're having in Brazil. So we do have many reforms that we need to propose. Also, we need to understand that the immediate reforms that we're talking about, we have an administrative reform where we can't fire public employees as easily as other countries. We have a tremendously harsh labor law, and that impedes action in Brazil, not only public action, but also entrepreneurial action for you to hire and fire. So the cost of hiring and firing are super high in Brazil because of the labor laws. So that needs to be refined. We need to get that out of the way. We need to make sure that we have an administrative reform, so we can do a tax reform. That's another thing that we needed to do. We can't do a tax reform if we still have an incredible cost associated with running government in Brazil. Now, here's where big problem happens. We have different regions of Brazil where public servicemen, they don't represent much of the electoral basis. So like the southeast and the center of Brazil, you're probably talking about 100 million people, probably a little bit more, 110, 120 million people. And in those areas, in public employees, they represent about 10, maybe the top is a 10 to 12% of the electoral basis. However, when you go to the northeast regions, which are the poorest regions of Brazil, and the ones that have the more amount of states, public employees, they represent over 40% of the electoral base. And in some cities, they represent 70% of the electoral base. So these are people that are considered working individuals. However, they work for the government and they vote for candidates that will always want for better conditions for the public employee. So in that sense, taxes will always be high on a poor area, where you're always constantly voting for, mostly socialist representatives on these poor areas. And what happens is a dynamic where you can't really get out of. You can't really deregulate. You can't reduce taxes in those areas because you have this massive, gigantic system that you need a fund for. So in those cases, those areas, I think the right way to get out of it is to actually leave them to go bankrupt. So the union would have to not bail them out, which has been the case over the last 100 years. So we need to have them to go bankrupt in order for them to get out of that mode of socializing everything and making your territory totally unviable for the public, for entrepreneurs and for the private sector. So we have different Brazils within the Brazilian scenario, where the southeast and center end up paying taxes for the north and northeast. They are the ones that are getting all the social benefits, and all the public, the union public spending goes to the poorer states, and the richer states and the ones that are actually driving the economy ahead, they're overburdened by this type of dynamic. And politically, we have issues there on representation. So these are the internal challenges of Brazil as far as reforms are concerned: administrative reform, tax reform, which goes directly to the economy, and the political reform that stems from short-term, smaller reforms on the electoral system, the party system. But I think eventually, if we want to make Brazil a first-rate, first world country, we would need to go ahead and even do a constitutional reform in order to limit the power that all the public, all the elective representatives they have after they assume office. So these are just a general broad outline of the challenges that Brazil faces. So very happy to debate them with you going forward in this schedule. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for that very thorough presentation on what is the reform agenda for Brazil. Now I would like to give the floor to our chairman, Tomas Regalado, who is a Cuban American politician and a former broadcast journalist who served as the 42nd mayor of Miami from 2009 to 2017, where he really did wonders in terms of making the city more international, more fiscal conservative, more pleasant to all the people of South Florida. He's a member of the Republican Party and a very, very admired citizen of South Florida. Please, Mayor Regalado. I would like to say hello to one of the very distinguished attending persons here, that is the former ambassador of the United States to Brazil, Ms. Liliana Ayalde, who's following this forum. Hi, Liliana. Thank you for being with us. Mayor Regalado.
Thank you, Beatrice. I'm really honored to participate in this forum for many reasons. First of all, because when you and the board asked me to chair this institute, we had a lot of plans, and then we had the lockdown, and then we had the virus, and then we couldn't get out of the homes. But actually, I think that we have learned to live the new normal, and I do think that these forums are necessary. These forums are important because we need to convey the message of our neighbors to our constituents, and people need to know, because information is power. I was fascinated with what has been said about the situation in Brazil, because the only thing you hear about Brazil is about the number of cases of the virus, and sometimes some statement by President Bolsonaro that the media plays in a different context of what he meant. But I do think that we have to learn from Brazil, from the problems that they're having, and the ambitious reform that they want to do. We are now going into a reform process, and the problem that we have, and listen, I have been a journalist all my life. I had the honor of being a White House correspondent in the 80s during the Reagan years and Bush 41. And I can tell you unequivocally that the mainstream press is not as objective as we thought it was. And I think that Fabio brought the issue of the social media. I think that eventually what is happening in this country because of the social media, and the Institute should do more about what is mainstream media and social media, is something that will put us forward in terms of social media reform, because we in the mainstream media cannot publish or air a comment or a news if we don't have two sources to do it. And yet you can do whatever you want in the social media. You can tarnish anybody's reputation. You can say weird conspiracy theories, and this is what has been fueling some of the issues and problems that we had in the last few days. So what I can tell our colleagues from Brazil is that Brazil is very important. Brazil is and was important for the city of Miami. Brazil was one of the most important economic engines that we had in the city of Miami. Brazil sneezes and we get cold. We catch a cold because of the tourism. But also, I think that Brazil can learn from us, from you, from Carlos, from me. I was born in Cuba but raised in the United States. But I follow the Cuban regime because of my father being a journalist and a political prisoner, and everybody has in the Cuban American community, everybody has a family who was the victim of the Castro regime. And I remember, because I was told and remember that in the 60s, Che Guevara pledged to create 1, 2, 3 new Vietnams in Latin America. And Brazil was the main target. And then he went to Bolivia, Carlos' country, and then Castro in 1959 invaded Venezuela with 10 people, and Dominican Republic. So Brazil has been always the target for those who want to control the natural resources and that magnificent country. So I just hope that Brazil understand that they need to do more public relations. They need to do more public information campaigns, because the thing that Luiz was saying are worth showing and printing those ambitious plans, so the United States can see that there are countries who wants to step up and become real leaders in the world. There's not much that we can teach Brazil now, because we have scientists here who say that we cannot go to a restaurant because we will be contagious. But at the same time, those same scientists say that it's okay that we go to a protest because racism is a health issue that we have to deal with in the United States. There's a lot of hypocrisy. There is a lot of, and everything has to do with the presidential election in the United States. But I just wanted to say to Fabio and Luiz that it's important that they keep talking. It's important that you, Beatrice, Carlos, the Institute continues to convey the message that Latin America wants to be better, that Latin America cannot be dismissed as a failed continent, and that those plans need to be helped by the United States and by every democratic country. And, hopefully we will be meeting in person and no mask soon, but we must continue these conversations about Brazil and about our beloved continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we close this session, I would like all participants to give their closing remarks in 3 minutes. So I'm going to start with our Executive Director, Carlos, and then we're going to go on with Fabio, with Phillipe, and the closing 3 minutes to our chairman. Please, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. I need just a second. Congratulations, all is very important. But let me do a single point. Brazil's democracy is very important to the region, to the Americas, and the world. Brazil's democracy is at risk today by Castro-Chavism conspiracy against President Bolsonaro. The Sao Paulo Forum, el Foro de Sao Paulo, is the instrument. Let's sound the alarm in the right direction. Bolsonaro is the goal of the conspiracy against democracy. This is my point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. Fabio?
Thank you very much for the opportunity of being here. I would like also to say hi to Ambassador Liliane. I know her from a visit she organized to the United States with another investors like 6 or 7 years ago. So hi, Lilian. There is another very important point in this debate that we are going to hopefully conduct in the next months, not only in the political system, but also in the property rights system. In Brazil, we never had a true economic freedom, never. So it's time to have. And these reforms, and Luiz Phillipe, he's amazing to speak, and I admire you not only for this, Luiz Phillipe, but it was very good. The economic reforms, and they are essential to our development. We have a Minister of Treasury, a Secretary of Treasury, which is a Chicago PhD, Paulo Guedes, and he's fighting a lot. He has an amazing team, and he needs support. He needs not only the support of the Congress, of the people, but also international support, like investors, like think tanks. And I am very happy of being a founding member of Instituto Pacificador, which is a think tank, which is a friend think tank of the Interamerican Institute of Democracy. And Luiz Phillipe is also a member there. And we are trying very hard to promote this debate, this discussion, and to reach a high level of understanding and to promote peace and freedom here in Brazil. It's what we need. So I appreciate, I'm always at your disposal to discuss further about these topics. Thank you.
Thank you. Phillipe, please.
Well, thank you. I would like to thank the Interamerican Institute for Democracy, Mayor Regalado. It's been a long time we haven't seen each other. Hopefully next time I'll go to Miami, I'll be well received. Fabio, thank you very much for your interference, very instructive. Jose Carlos Berzain, your comment was very appropriate. I think that there's a new paradigm in Brazil with President Bolsonaro. He brings in a new view of how to conduct policy, to conduct politics, and also, which is my hope, is that we actually go forth in having incredible reforms of our system, and that is just ushering a beginning for a new reality for Brazil. And part of this reality cannot deal with the risk of entities such as Foro São Paulo, the International Socialist Movement, China interference, or any other country interference in our sovereignty, in our democracy. Democracy means power of the local districts, power of the people, and that is far from the reality that we have in Brazil. We have a representative democracy, representative system that allies itself, our representatives many times ally themselves with these interest groups. Some of them are internal interest groups, most of them are external interest groups. So we have to fight that out of our system in order for us to become a beacon for the region, in order for us to become peaceful, in order for us to become prosperous. And I think that's, knowing that is the beginning of the process. So thank you very much, Beatrice, also for organizing all this, and hope to see you guys soon, eventually in another forum. Thank you very much.
Our chairman for his closing remarks.
Well, I think that this is important. And this is important because of social media. This forum will be seen and heard by hundreds of thousands of people, hopefully, because Brazil is important. But we are in Miami, and we have a brand name. And, you know, a lot of people, when I used to go to Congress to lobby for the city of Miami, when those 8 years of mayor, you know, I keep saying to senators and congressmen, you know, I come from the closest Latin American city to the United States. We are a rainbow of nationalities and cultures, but this is a city that hurts for every Latin American country because we are Latin American countries that are hosting their residents. That is why the Institute is so important. That is why this think tank needs to rally to support democracy in Brazil. And if that is the only thing that we can do, we should do, because Brazil is too big to fail, too important to fail. It's something that we need in this hemisphere to be a balance of what Carlos has always been telling the Castro Chavism. We're not crazy. This is real. The conspiracy are real. They just want to take over those countries and even these countries. So hopefully Beatrice will organize more things, and we should send copy of this to member of Congress. Now we have our own senator as the chairman of the Intelligence Committee of the Senate, the second most important position in the U.S. Senate. So we can do this. We need people like Fabian and Luiz and people that can tell us what is going on and what their hopes and the dreams are for Brazil to become a shining light for Latin America. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to our viewers. And this is the first event of the Brazilian program of the Interamerican Institute for Democracy. We still hope and think that we are going to be able to do the book launch with Phillipe d'Orléans sometime this year. But if we don't, we will have several of these cybernetic forums from our institute. Thank you so much, and good evening to everybody.
Thank you.